Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots to get to this morning. First and foremost, gas prices have hit a record all-time high. And actually, we just checked this morning, and it's up another 10 cents from when it already hit the record yesterday. We're going to talk to you about that, the overall economic picture. We also have an expert on energy markets specifically to break down what exactly was going on, what we can expect for the future. There have been some indications that Biden might have gotten a little bit of a bump post-State of the Union, and also potentially with his response to Ukraine. We're going to look at all of the relevant polls and see how real that is. We also have the latest in the media's handling of the Ukraine situation, and Saagar's got a little scoop for you. Some super inside baseball, but it actually really matters in terms of who gets to ask people in power questions.
You guys will enjoy it. I have some inside the room audio exclusive here to the show of some corruption inside the White House press briefing room as to how exactly the legacy press is rigging the game. Something near and dear to my heart because I once was inside that room and I wanted to show you, all of you. So we're going to break all of that down. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, it's actually a fascinating look, sort of peek behind the curtain. But we wanted to start with the very latest on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've been doing these and you guys have found them very, very helpful. So let's continue. We have the map here from SimTac. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. The battle situation on the ground remains a bit static. So the Russian offensive in Kiev is continuing with some pretty intensive fighting up there near the city along the Irpin River. Over on the east, you have near Kharkiv. Ukrainian forces actually pushed the Russian forces back along one of the major strategic highways, but bombardments on military and civilian targets are continuing across that. The siege of Mariupol continues in down in the southern eastern region. That's actually the most important one from a humanitarian perspective because that's where a lot of the corridors that are trying to be set up are happening. And unfortunately, many of those corridors have not stood the test of time. And we are seeing a lot of civilians getting killed or injured or unable to flee whenever that's happening. So that's where a lot of the eyes of the world. And the same thing in the strategic city of Odessa. There continues to be heavy fighting. But there was no major change in the overall battle picture. The most important thing came with the breaking news that we brought you at the top of our show yesterday about some Russian demands in which they said that they could find a ceasefire. And the demands that they laid out are murky because on the one hand, they sound a bit reasonable. Here's what they are. Number one, Ukraine must recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea. Number two, they must recognize the independence of those eastern separatist regions, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. But number three is where things got murky. So they said that they wanted a constitutional amendment by Ukraine to guarantee neutrality and no entrance into any bloc. That would include the European Union and into NATO. Now, if it was just those three, I could see a reasonable deal to be struck there. But there were also reports that inside the room that there was a suggestion made that the Ukrainians would continue to have to abide by, quote, demilitarization, which is not going to happen after you've just invaded their entire country. And two was about the political leadership of the country itself, the suggestion that Zelensky might be able to stay as some sort of puppet prime minister or president, but then that Russia could install the man who actually runs the country. Obviously, that's just a frank, total non-starter. And the Ukrainian President Zelensky was asked about this on ABC News yesterday. Let's take a listen to his full response.
When the Kremlin says these three conditions to end the war, that you must give up on joining NATO, recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and recognize the independence of those two separatist regions in the east, to Vladimir Putin, who will get this message from you, you say it's a non-starter, not willing to those three conditions right now?
The question is more difficult than simply acknowledging them. This is another ultimatum, and we are not prepared for ultimatums. But we have the possible resolution for these three items, key items. What needs to be done is for President Putin to start talking, start the dialogue, instead of living in the informational bubble without oxygen. I think that's where he is. He is in this bubble. He's getting this information, and you don't know how realistic that information is that he's getting.
So that was the response from President Zelensky saying that Putin is delusional. I think he could be referring to some of those more secretive parts of what's being talked about in those rooms. There's also been some crazy developments there. But overall, there's a statement from Dmitry Peskov that came yesterday. Let's put that up there on the screen. He said that Russia will stop, quote, in a moment if they meet those terms. But as we said, what those terms are and what they mean is very, very nebulous. It may sound reasonable and they might say, but then in terms of what the full demand and what it would look like in practice means that a stop in the fighting, Krystal, is not going to come anytime soon. And obviously, just every single day that this continues, tension between our two countries, the United States and Russia, continues, but people are dying. I mean, that really is, of course, the chief people we should be concerned
And
about.
the civilian situation on the ground in Ukraine is just continuing to worsen, not only because of Russian shelling in certain parts of the country, but because you also have, the number I saw was 1,000 villages and cities that now are without any sort of power, electric, water. You're talking food shortages. So even on those sorts of metrics, especially in the city of Mariupol, you have people who are really struggling and suffering right now. And that is one of the ways that Russia is putting pressure on Ukraine to try to force their capitulation. On the deal, quote unquote, that was offered here by Russia, murky as it is, I think you're right from our perspective that if it really was, okay, you can have Crimea, okay, you can have the Eastern Separatist republics, and okay, fine, we'll put a constitutional amendment in to agree not to join any bloc. From my perspective, that's the best deal you could get. Because, listen, I understand.
If you kept autonomy, though, over the rest
exactly.
of it, right? Yeah.
And so, but I also understand from the Ukrainian perspective how they don't see that to be a reasonable deal at all. I mean, I don't think we would, if we're talking about the U.S., feel too great about just agreeing like, okay, you can have Florida and, you can have a couple other states as well. California, sorry, see ya. So I'm not sure even if it was just quote unquote those pieces that the Ukrainians would agree even to that. But then you layer on top of that demilitarization, forget about it. I mean, you were just invaded. There's no way that you're going to agree to lay down all of your weapons and completely disarm. The Russians, the way they spin this is they say, we really are right now finishing the demilitarization of Ukraine. We will finish it. So they're saying, listen, we've got that part taken care of. We've almost demilitarized the whole thing. That belies what the reporting on the ground is, which is that Ukrainian resistance has been greatly bolstered, of course, by us and other NATO allies. They also have been much logistically and tactically smarter and sounder than the Russians. I was actually just reading this morning that the things that you never know you're going to learn until it comes to a crisis like this. The Russian military is very dependent on rail. And especially because I guess the situation with roads in Russia is not always the best. So when it comes to rail and when it comes to their own country, they're very, very strong. But once you get outside of a large network of rail yards, that's when you start to have problems. And then, of course, as we've been tracking, since this didn't go as quickly as they thought, they really weren't provisioned for the long term. And so that's why you've seen trouble with fuel, trouble with food, trouble with morale. I was also reading most Western countries have a sort of system where from the ground, you're sending back reports of, okay, we need these supplies, we need these provisions. Russia tends to operate more on a sort of push system where there's like a regular basis that they're trying to resupply troops and ration troops. And that because this has gone on longer than they ultimately expected and they didn't achieve their objectives in the time frame that they thought, that has also been a problem in terms of reprovisioning. And, so all that being said, the fact of the matter is, even though the Ukrainians have put up a fierce resistance that was more than most analysts expected, the bulk of the military might still lies on the Russian side. Most analysts still think it's a matter of time before they take Kyiv, before they, take Odessa and actually achieve the objectives in terms of the cities that they want to claim here. So that's why when we're looking from the outside and we're like, giving up Crimea and the Eastern Separatist republics, that might not be great, but that's probably the best that you could possibly get if you put aside the other pieces, the giving up, having the puppet government, the demilitarization. So listen, that's why this is at a standstill, and we're likely to face a long sort of grinding civil war insurgency kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's the key point. And I want to say this too, the Ukrainians, look, I would fight like hell if I were you. I get it. I mean, I'm, just an outside observer. We're interested in peace and we have our own grand strategic achievements. So, you do you, and ultimately it's your country. That's the problem, which I think is that they are going to find it just so incredibly difficult to not succumb to any deal without being guaranteed their actual sovereignty. And at this point, I mean, you've been invaded. Like, you don't have any reason. And this is why I just don't see any situation. There's no face save whenever it comes to Putin, and same when it comes to Zelensky. He's a proud man, and the people around him too. As long as he's alive and he's the president of Ukraine, as long as Putin is alive and he's the president, this thing is going to go on for years, and we're going to see some sort of guerrilla insurgency. War is about attrition, but the Russians are finding out some of the things that people have found out the hard way when they invaded them. That term you're talking about, for the reason why they're so reliant on mechanized rail, is because of something called Rasputitsa, which is the term of the muddy season. Now, this matters. I just read Andrew Roberts' history of the Second World War, and this was something that bit the Germans in the ass during this Battle of Stalingrad. And they were like, hey, none of our mechanized or mechanized tanks work. We're literally stuck in the mud. Oh, and that's how 2 million people froze in a field in Stalingrad. So it's something that they're now repeating the mistake of people who've invaded them from the east.
Interesting.
And Napoleon as well, apparently it happened to him. And the term is so famous that it's a military terminology and, has its own page and everything. I think it matters, though, because the hubris that the Russian military displayed in this episode is they have forgotten the lessons of their own experience in Afghanistan. They have forgotten the lessons of their own experience in Chechnya. And they have forgotten the experience of the United States in Vietnam, of the United States in Afghanistan, and the United States in Iraq. We keep going back to Iraq. Look, it's only been, 14 days, something like that, since the invasion. It took 3 weeks for the U.S. to cruise to Baghdad, and we bombed the hell out of that country with shock and awe. And then it took 12 months before the insurgency really began to form. And within 2 years, you had a full-blown civil war. By my last count, they had 200,000 troops in the country. At the highest, we had 150,000 in Iraq. And Iraq was roughly similar there to the size of Ukraine. So good luck. I mean, you broke it. You bought it. You're going to be dealing with this for many years to come. What happened in Syria is much more likely to happen here in Ukraine. Big population, lots of weapons flowing in from all, different various foreign interests, a collapse
foreign fighters flowing in too.
Foreign fighters. It's happening too. Like you said, there are many Eastern Europeans who are going. Apparently, there's some Americans going over there.
You've got Chechens on both sides.
Right, Chechens are flooding in, or kind of the shock troops of a lot of the Russian military. So look, this is turning into a massive mess. The accidental guerrilla syndrome, which is that you create a bunch of guerrillas by invading the country and then pushing them to the most extreme elements, all seems incredibly likely with all of this. And
the more brutal you are towards civilians, the more guerrillas you're going to ultimately create. I mean, this was another lesson that the Soviets should have learned in Afghanistan, because those were the dynamics there. And I think there's one other factor that is going to, one more obstacle in the way of any kind of a negotiated settlement here, which is that the Ukrainian people really believe that they can outright win. I saw a poll. I mean, any polling during this time is highly unreliable, but I did see a poll that said 80% of Ukrainians think they can outright win. And so if you think like, oh, we're winning this thing and we're going to be able to repel the invaders, then you're not in a mood to compromise on anything. So I think that is another thing that, I understand, like, obviously they've been heartened by the response, by their ability to keep Russia out of Kyiv, keep Russia out of Odessa, repel them in key places. But the fact that they are convinced that they can, over the long term, completely prevail here in the next few weeks, that's going to prevent any sort of significant concessions. And let's be clear, there would have to be really significant concessions in order to have any kind of a negotiated settlement.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I know this may sound trite, but I always think about the scene from Gladiator whenever they're like, you people should know when they're conquered. And he's like, would you? He's like, would I?
Yeah.
And look,
Of course
I mean,
not.
it's a good point.
Yeah.
And look, the civilians are the ones who are paying the price. Let's put this up there on the screen. As of yesterday, well, this was about the third round of talks. Let's go ahead and put the next one up there in terms of the refugees from the UN Human Rights Council. They said 1.7 million people have fled from Ukraine. Actually, that number just got updated right now. And in 12 days, only 12 days as this conflict has happened, we've had 2 million people flee the country, a country of 44 million. So you can see there, I think it's like 5% or whatever. I mean, that's just going to continue to increase over the next couple of years. And that's the same thing. You know, Syria 2.0, a lot of people fled in the beginning. The worse things got, more and more people fled, caused massive geopolitical instability all across the Middle East and in Europe. Now, you know, same thing. Whenever it comes to Europe, this is going to be a long and a grinding war. 12 days is just not that long amount of time. I mean, almost every conflict lasts for, you know, minimum of like 1 year. Very short wars, extraordinarily rare. The shortest ones can be several months, and that's when you have an outright strategic objective being taken, which does not look likely for the Russians. So it's a bad situation.
On those refugees, yesterday when the numbers were 1.7 million refugees, I looked up where they were predominantly going to, and it's overwhelmingly to Poland. So when it was 1.7 million refugees, 1 million plus of those were in Poland alone. The next largest single country was Hungary at 180,000, then Slovakia at 128,000, and down the list of ways was Russia at 53,000. You know, that was another thing from the talks yesterday, because the two sides did meet and, you know, attempt to negotiate and have some sort of a diplomatic interaction. And they said there was very limited progress, but they did potentially make some progress on these humanitarian corridors so more civilians could escape. And what the Ukrainians are saying is that the Russians, the escape routes, the corridors they wanted to open up were for people to go to Russia.
Yeah, right.
The Ukrainians are like, I don't think that much of our population is really Some of them.
Some of them do want to go to Russia. We should be clear,
But I mean, you can see by this number what the proportion is. You've got 1 million refugees in Poland. You got 53,000 in Russia, according to those numbers. But yeah, so that was kind of a non-starter in terms of the actual routes. But they say there was some minor progress made, so we'll hope that civilians are able to evacuate if they want to.
There you go.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.